In this video, we are going to show you how to replace your front brake pads and rotors. Let's get started. Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. The first thing you need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheels are off the ground. After you have the wheel up in the air, continue on by removing all 6 of your 21mm lug nuts, and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of there, we have a nice clear view of our brakes. We've got the rotor and the pads located behind the caliper. Now to start taking apart the caliper, we're going to gently get in between the caliper using a small pry bar. I want to get in between this area and gently pry up against the inboard side of the rotor. While I'm prying on this, it's supposed to push in these pistons. If you can feel it move around, that means it's working. We'll move along to this one. There we are. Now let's continue on to each of our caliper slider bolts. Now let's take one of our lug nuts and a spacer. We're going to use this to hold the rotor in place while we continue. At this point, we're ready to move along to our 2 14mm slider bolts. Let's start with the top bolt. Pull that out, give it a quick inspection. After that, I put it back in a couple threads for safety. Continue on by fully removing the lower bolt. Fully remove the first bolt. Carefully take the caliper and put it up here. Keep in mind, you do not want this to fall down, but we do need to have a look at our caliper pistons. Let's have a look along where the piston boot is here. You want to make sure that you don't see any fluid or damage on the piston or the boot going around it. That's the seal. Assuming there's no fluid or damage, we're going to continue pushing back both of the pistons. When you do this, it's important to make sure you push back both pistons at the same time. Otherwise, when you push one in, the other will go out. We'll do this slowly. Double check for damage or moisture. Set this aside. Continue on by removing each of your brake pads. Give them a quick inspection for wear, and then set them aside. Now let's have a look at the backside here. You're going to find 2 21mm bolts that hold the bracket to your knuckle. Start with the top bolt. Fully remove it, give it a quick inspection, and then thread it in a couple threads. Fully remove your lower bolt, give that an inspection. Remove your bracket, set it aside. Now let's move along to removing the brake rotor. We'll remove our safety nut and spacer. Remove the rotor from the bearing. At this point, we're clear to start putting on some copper never sees on the mating surface. Let's wipe down the braking surface on our rotors. Take that rotor and put it in place. Once you have it on there, continue on with a spacer and one of your lug nuts. We want to make sure we're holding this rotor in place so it cannot wobble around. Now it's going to be time to clean your caliper bracket. Obviously, ours is brand new, so I'm going to show you how to clean this one. To get started on cleaning up the caliper bracket, we are going to disassemble it. We'll start with each of the caliper bracket tins. Carefully get under those, give them a quick inspection, set them aside for recycling. Your new kit came with new tins. Once you have both of those off, continue on to your caliper slider pins. you'll notice that these pins have a rubber boot going over them. Let's grab onto that boot and carefully pull it off of the caliper bracket. Now, once you have it off of there, we're also going to pull the boot off of the caliper slider pin. That can easily be done by pressing it down on a bench and sliding it off of the pin itself. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the caliper slider boot. You want to make sure it's soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. This is important to keep all the moisture and debris out of this area, otherwise your brakes will not function properly. Once you think it looks okay, continue on to cleaning it out. I'll take a rag, give it a little twist, and slide it through the far end. Once I've done that, I can continue on by doing this, and that's essentially going to work all the grease and goo out of the inside of this boot. Give it one last inspection, and then do the exact same thing on the other side of the caliper bracket. Now that we've finished cleaning and inspecting our boots, move along to each of the slider pins. We'll wipe down the entire smooth shaft of this pin. Give it a close inspection. You want to make sure it's not rotted and pitted or damaged in any way. This needs to be able to flow smoothly inside of your caliper bracket without restriction. Another area that you want to pay attention to is all the way up here by where my fingers are holding this. You can tell that there's a groove. That groove is where the boot is supposed to sit. It needs to be clean and free of debris as well. As you can tell, I fully cleaned this one. Now I'll do the same to the other one, and we'll continue on with our bracket. Now that I have my boots and slider pins cleaned up, we'll set those aside, and it's time to move back to the bracket itself. There's going to be several areas on the bracket that you want to pay attention to. Along each side of the bracket, you're going to have two areas where that tin slid onto. That needs to be clean and smooth from any rough surface. If you have any raised debris in this area, it's going to cause a restriction in the pad movement and could potentially cause a braking issue. Remove any raised areas and then go ahead and clean it down with a sanding disc or wire wheel. Okay, now at this point you can tell that I cleaned this entire beveled area all the way up over this ridge. I did the same on both sides. It looks perfect. Let's continue on to each of our slider ports. To clean these, it's a good idea to have it over a collection receptacle. We're going to use a little bit of parts cleaner inside of each of the ports, and then we'll also continue with a bore brush. You want to make sure you clean out any of the existing debris inside this area. Give it a little rinse. Do the same on the other side. Now the last thing we want to deal with on the bracket is along this area right here. Now as I showed you on the slider pin, it has a groove for the boot to sit into. You have the same thing on the bracket itself. Go ahead and have a close look at that and make sure it's clean and free of any raised areas. Now that the bracket is fully cleaned and inspected, we're going to continue on with some high temperature caliper lubricant. You want to make sure that you lubricate the two areas on both sides of the bracket that you cleaned. Now let's move along to our caliper bracket tins. Pay attention to this area. As you can tell, it's a raised tab, and that tab needs to fit directly into this area. That's what locks it in place. We'll take this, slide it in, press it inside each of the grooves, and then make our way into the center and press it up in there as well. That locks it in. go ahead and give it a little tug to make sure it's completely secure. Once you're sure one side is good, do the same on the other side. Now let's move along to each of our caliper slider pins. You want to make sure you lubricate the entire shaft of the caliper slider. This will help ensure that the caliper functions freely. As I'm doing the entire shaft, I'm going to make my way up to this groove that I mentioned to you. By putting a little bit of grease in this area, it'll help keep moisture and debris out. Now, not only am I going to go there, but I'll also come over to the bracket with a little bit of lubricant just around those grooves that I just mentioned. There we are. Now it's time for the caliper slider boot. Now looking at the boot, where my index finger is, you can tell on this particular boot, it has a raised area that's larger than the far side. So when we put this together, you want to make sure you take the smaller side and start sliding it over the caliper slider pin. Press it all the way up into that groove. Give it a little spin to make sure that the grease is working its way in, and then mount it into the caliper bracket. We'll press it in, make sure the boot is sitting in the groove all the way around. Once it's in there, just work that pin and boot around. That feels good. Continue on to the other side. Once you have it in there, go ahead and clean up your mess. Now you can install the caliper bracket on the vehicle. Let's get our caliper bracket in place and install both of our caliper bracket bolts. Once you have both of them started, snug them up and then torque them to 155 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our front brake pads. It's important to make sure that your inboard pad has a wear indicator and it's facing in the proper direction. Let's take that inboard pad and slide it into position. You'll notice each of the ears should fit into the bracket, and once it slides in, it should be able to flow freely. If it feels as though it's restricted or you have to use a hammer and bonk it in there, generally that means something isn't cleaned properly. Now we'll do the same for the outer pad. Slides right in. Now it's time to install the muscle aspect of the caliper. We're going to make our way to each of these two pistons. Go ahead and apply a little bit of lubricant to this. By applying lubricant in these areas, it's going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Slide this over the pads. Time for our two caliper slider bolts. Start those in. If you want to apply some blue thread locker to these, it's a good idea. Now we can bottom each of these out and then torque them to 32 foot-pounds. All right, at this point, we have everything back together. We know we torqued it along the way. Now just double check that flex hose. You want to make sure that it looks like this and it's not twisted like a pigtail on the way up, otherwise you're going to have brake fluid restriction. Now we can remove our safety lug nut and spacer. At this point, you're ready to reinstall your wheel. We'll start on all 6 of our 21mm lug nuts, snug up the lug nuts, get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and then torque each of them to 97 foot-pounds. With the wheels safely back on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. All right, friend, we showed you how to do one side of the vehicle's front brakes. Obviously, you're going to want to do the exact same thing on the other side of the car. Once you've done that, go ahead and take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.